Fabulous. So, introductions. Perfect opportunity to do introductions, apologies. So, it's basically the whole ITC team doing this little session. There's only one member of the team that isn't doing it. I'm Zoe Bateman, I'm General Manager at ITC. We've got Jackie Elliman, who I mentioned before, Legal and Industrial Relations Manager. Thea Stanton, our Communications Manager.
Hello.
And Charlotte Jones, CEO of ITC. So we'll all be presenting throughout this presentation. Very quickly, just an overview for those that don't know who we are. What is the Independent Theatre Council? Well, we're a management association, which means we have a membership of organisations, about 150, just over 150 performing arts companies and producers from right across the UK, working in multiple art forms, so theatre, dance, circus, street arts, now quite a lot of kind of online digital companies, whether that's their primary focus or new focus. And they are at all different stages in their careers. Some of them have just come out of university and they're just starting out, and some of them have been around for 50, 70 years and they're more established. We've got, you know, independent producers right up to venues, so a real mix, but all of them are working in the kind of independent performing arts world, often subsidised by sort of funding, and that's kind of area of work, so non-commercial. So we're going to jump in with company formation, legal structure, which Jackie's going to present.
Thanks, Zoe. Setting up a registered company is one of the key staging points for most performing arts organisations in their development. And the clue is that we're setting up a limited company, and it's that word limited, which is short for limited liability, which is what makes it important. At the moment, I suspect many of you are trading as freelancers, or you're a loose group of freelancers, perhaps with some rules, something you call a board. You feel like you're an organisation, but if you're not yet registered with Companies House, you're still a group of freelancers, of individuals, and whatever you do, you are personally liable. That means you enter into contracts. If someone thinks that you've broken them or not done what you said you'll do, they'll sue you personally. You will have to pay personally. It's your money, your assets that are on the line. Once you set up a limited company, you set up a separate legal entity. It's a new person in your organisation, effectively, even though it will still feel like it's all about you. The company enters into contract, the company employs people, and it's the company that is generally in the firing line. So that's why it's an important point for most organisations. It's not something you necessarily need to consider immediately, but I think the moment you are employing people, engaging people, entering into large contracts for goods or services, you must think about it. And you will find, contrary-wise, that funders, venues, people like that will also prefer to deal with a company rather than an individual once you reach a certain level. And this is because, as I hope you've heard, that limited liability is a big benefit. And you don't, as they say, get out for out in this world. So in return for limited liability, you're much more visible, you're accountable, you're traceable. Anyone can go to the Companies House register and see who your board of directors are, whether you're making your annual returns properly. They can see your accounts. They can see if you're a large, small, medium-sized company, if you're making money or losing money. So these things actually are a benefit. Funders will prefer it because if they give you money as an individual, you can just vanish. This way, in theory, at least they can trace you. So it's a hoop to jump through that enhances your credibility. It also I'm slightly hesitant about this because it sounds a bit preachy, because people sort of get a bit daunted by the idea of the admin involved with a company. But having been involved with lots of companies in roles like company secretary for a lot of years, I don't think it's that bad, so long as you make sure that you've got someone who's quite happy dealing with admin to do it, because it gives you a framework. When you set up a company, most ITC companies will be 2 or 3 people. They will be the first members of the company, they'll be the first board of directors, and they'll still be running it. It'll feel like it's all about you still. But in fact, when you come to have a board meeting, you're going to be changing hats. And you're going to have to stop and say, we need proper accounts, we need a proper management report, because we must not be negligent. And it gives you that opportunity to stand back a bit from the day-to-day grind. And performing arts is a fabulous industry, but it's hard work. And it gives you that ability to look at yourself objectively that can be useful. So that's a funny little benefit that's not one of the obvious ones. Another very important benefit is that for a few years now, there has finally been a theatre tax relief, which means that if you are, this sounds slightly airy-fairy, but trust us, it's true, if you are eligible to pay corporation tax, that's the tax on any profits you make, even if you're not actually paying that tax, you're not making those profits, you can reclaim 15 to 20% of your production costs for up to the first performance, because you're eligible for corporation tax. And that's proved really beneficial for so many companies in our sector. I think there's a whole meeting on that which will be open later in the day, about 1 o'clock, if you want to read up a bit more about it. We're moving on to the next slide.
Yeah. Just before we do, can everybody mute if they're not, other than Jackie, just so we don't get any background noise, please?
It was quite exciting.
It sounded like an airport. I'm very excited.
I was reckoning escaping lions in one of those boxes.
There we go.
So you've decided you've reached the point where registering a company at Companies House is what you need to do next. And the next thing to remember is, what structure do you need? Because most companies, most normal companies, have shareholders. They're companies with share capital. But the trouble with that is, if you are, as most ITC members are, going for public funding, public funders aren't likely to be happy with that, because share companies distribute their profits. For profits doesn't mean you make more than you spend. Not for profit doesn't mean you can't make more than you spend. Not for profit means that if there is a profit, it mustn't go to a few individual investors. It must go back into your reserves for your art. And that's what most funders will want, because they won't want any of their funding that's left over just to go to 1 or 2 people. So there's a slightly strange structure called limited by guarantee, where instead of going to your mates and saying, I've got this great idea for a company, why don't you invest some money in it? And say you've invested 10% of our capital, you'll get 10% of any profits. That's shares, that's profit distribution. You just go to them and say, I've got this great idea. If you support it, why not be a member of the company? And all you need to do is promise to pay £1 if the company goes under, to form part of the assets of the company. And because you haven't got an expectation of a share of profits, you can actually write into the constitution that the company is not going to distribute profits. So most performing arts organisations set up as companies limited by guarantee. A word of caution, it's not a particularly usual structure. I went to law school after many years in not-for-profit theatre, and I was totally thrown when we got to talking about company registration, that it was all about share companies. So you will find that many accountants and high street lawyers don't actually know about this structure. If you're an ITC member, we can help with this. So that's one little service we provide. Can we have next slide, please? That's, I think, a very, very quick introduction to what company status company structure is all about. Sorry, I'm just contradicting myself before I begin. For many organisations, another step, not immediately in most cases I would suggest, but a bit further down the line, is acquiring charitable status, which is not another new organisation structure. In many cases, if you've set up a company, you will apply for that company to become a charitable company. And charitable status is mostly about money. An awful lot of it is about tax benefits. There are benefits such as gift aid, payroll giving, inheritance tax, where if somebody is a taxpayer and gives you money, you get an extra, somebody tell me if I'm right or wrong, 20 to 25%. There are 1 or 2 VAT exemptions, but not a huge amount. And any trading that you do for your charitable purposes, which is mostly to advance the arts, promote the art of drama, if you make profits on that, you don't pay the corporation tax that we mentioned earlier. As an aside, though, bear in mind that even if you don't pay corporation tax, if you're eligible for it, you're still eligible for theatre tax relief. Getting charitable status is quite a lengthy process. You have to show the quality of your art. You have to show that you do work that is educational, not just entertainment. You have to show the public benefit of your work. So the fact that you had to jump through all those hoops actually does give you an extra level of credibility. As I say, it can take 6 to 12 months, partly to pull together all the evidence you need, partly because in these financially challenged times, a lot of organisations want to be charities, and the Charity Commission is under a lot of pressure and is dealing with that, with a lot of applications. One of the key things finally about acquiring charitable status is you will have to move away from that structure that I mentioned earlier, where probably the initial 2 or 3 founders of the company are the board of directors and the people doing the day-to-day running. Once you have a charitable company, you have to have a volunteer board who are not what is called connected people. They normally shouldn't be working for the company except maybe on a very occasional freelance basis. So it is a very different mind frame. It is putting your artistic baby into new hands. It's an important and useful step, but one I would caution you approach slowly, carefully, and with a lot of forethought. And again, we can help you through this one and talk you through the pros and cons as you approach it. I think that's it. Time to move on to finance, and obviously I'm happy to take questions at the end, or if you want a one-to-one on this topic.
Superb, thank you, Jackie. So the next section is finance, which I will run through. Not many people go into the arts to do finance, but it is an absolute obvious essential part of running a successful business, and yeah, making a success of your company and of projects. It's really important to plan and budget your finances like you plan anything else. I would always advise that you start with budgeting for something. You know, you've got an idea for a production or a project, sit down and work out what that's going to cost you, and sort of do an ideal budget. You know, if you had the production exactly as you wanted it, with as many actors as you possibly could, and you know, it was going to have the most perfect set and stuff, start with that budget and then look at that bottom line and think, right, how am I going to finance that in terms of the income? And then you'll probably find that you want to start to kind of chip away at it and start to create a more realistic budget. But it really does allow you to start to think about what the realities of putting a production together are and what you're going to need to do in order for that to happen. Budgeting and finance are a real kind of key thing to get sorted at the beginning. And then that budget obviously becomes a working document where you can be sort of tweaking it as and when you get income. Say you get, you apply for 2 different funders and you get both of them, then your budget may be able to be a little bit healthier than you first sort of that you anticipated, and that. So it's a really, really useful tool for having that plan for whether that's a production, a project, or your company. You can do that on an annual or a sort of 2-yearly, 3-yearly basis as well, so that you can kind of plan out next steps for your company. In terms of day-to-day finance, it's essential you keep on top of it. It's really easy to let finance kind of slip down the priority list for more interesting, creative things to come, to kind of take your attention. So I recommend doing a little bit of finance every week, whether that's sort of half an hour each day, or you have a half a day that you set, Monday afternoons is going to be finance time. Really do try and stick to doing a little bit each week so that you keep on top of it. I've suggested here on the slide some accounting software that make it a lot easier. There are other ones, but these 3 all have free versions with slight limitations, of course, but I've heard that they're really, really good. Even the free versions are really good for getting started when you're a small company and your finances are quite simple, and then you kind of go on to a monthly subscription. You can link them to your bank accounts. I mean, it makes finance so simple now, having these online softwares. As Jackie mentioned, if you become, or you are a company, a limited company, then it's just worth bearing in mind that there is some paperwork in terms of the finance that you need to do annually. So you need to submit your accounts to Company House. This is quite simple to do. If your finances are simple, you can probably do that yourself, or you may get an accountant just to help you with that process and make sure that they are created and submitted correctly. And the last point here is just one that we feel is useful to bring people's attention to sort of highlight the importance of keeping on top of your finances and cash flow, because you only need to owe someone £750 to be kind of declared bankrupt. It's not a huge amount of money. You only need to owe them and not be able to pay them in order to be declared bankrupt. And it's not a huge amount of money. It could be quite easy to owe that, a couple of weeks actor's salary or an invoice for something. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that, making sure that when your money's coming in and when it's going out, and that you've got maybe a little bit of a kind of buffer pot so that you can make sure you're paying things on time is really, really important. Very quickly, finance top tips, as far as I can suggest. If you're not someone who enjoys finance or feels you're good at numbers, then that's absolutely fine. It's probably best to find someone who does, someone like me, sadly, who loves an Excel document and, gets a kick out of looking at numbers and seeing what story they tell. So find that person if it's not you, and if they want more confidence in their financial ability, then we run a number of finance courses that you could send them on, to sort of develop their finance skills and confidence. As I mentioned, make sure that you budget, and make sure you budget realistically. We have rates of pay on our website. They're a really good place to go to say how much are you going to pay your actors in line with the union rates. And when you are spending that money, try to stick to the budget that you have given yourself. If you're working in a team, make sure that you're having conversations with the team regularly. If they have their own micro budgets, then make sure that they're reporting back to you so that you're keeping on top of the total budget. Never has there been a time where contingencies are more important, I think. A contingency, for anyone that doesn't know, is a line in your expenditure that is for anything that's unforeseen. So, you know, if something costs more, or if someone, I don't know, you know, is ill and you need to pay for their kind of replacement or something like that. This can be anything between 5 to 10% of your total expenditure. And actually we have heard of many cases, especially recently, where it's now being budgeted at 15% of expenditure. So that's, you know, can be a substantial amount of money, but it's really useful to have it there in case something, you know, you need to pay for something that you haven't. And when you're applying for funding, they will expect to see a contingency in your budget. Keep organise records of income and expenditure and carve out time, as I said. Again, stay organised with finance, otherwise you just end up with a pile of, you know, whether it's a kind of real pile or a digital pile of invoices that you just need to kind of process. Really much easier if you just chip away at it. And then again, keep on top of everything by making sure you do a bank rec every month. That's where you make sure that your bank account is saying the same as your online, as your software, and that they match up so that you've got an accurate record of where you are in that moment, in terms of, because you've always got to make sure that you are the same as what your bank account says you are. So there are the finance tips, which moves us perfectly on to funding. How are you going to get that money? Thea, how are they going to get that money?
Okay. So, hello everyone. As Zoe mentioned in the introduction, I am the ITC comms manager, but I'm also an independent producer and choreographer. So I'm going to be speaking through both lenses, really. Looking at the slides, here are all the different categories of funds that you can apply for. I think first and foremost, you should be looking to raise funds from all of these areas. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. A lot of funders, particularly now, will be looking to see how you're minimizing risk with your income. So spreading out your sources of income is a fundamental way to do that. Let's quickly go through the categories. So on the top right-hand corner in the green box, we have government funding. So we have the Arts Council England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Creative Scotland, which all have a range of funding streams. Where a lot of you will be focused on is on project grants or their equivalent. Now this is funding for an isolated project, and the emphasis on these grants is the output and the reach of your project. Someone from inside the Arts Council once told me that almost the first thing they do when they receive your application is they look at the money that you're asking for, and they look at how many people you're reaching, both digitally and in person. So that's something to consider with your application. A contrasting funding stream is developing your creative practice, where the emphasis is instead placed on the impact that funding will have on you as an individual creative. This is currently suspended, but it will be coming back later this autumn. My advice with all these government funding streams is to plan ahead and to manage expectations. We were told at an Arts Council talk that project grants have a 38% success rate, and developing your creative practice has a 12% success rate. And these are stats prior to COVID. With project grants, I would try to apply at least 6 months in advance to your activity commencing, to give yourself enough time to apply twice, as rejected applications can receive useful feedback and you are able to apply again. Moving on, there are other lottery grant funding sources with the Heritage Lottery Fund, the Community Lottery Fund. With these funding sources, I would advise you to read the small print, as from personal experience, I know that the Heritage Lottery Fund tend to only accept applications from incorporated organisations. Local councils, or local government, we know they're squeezed, but there is sometimes money tucked away, and it's always worth asking, especially if you're doing a project that's particularly relevant to a local area. Other government departments, so similarly, there could be some money tucked away, and it's always worth asking. So if you're doing a project relating to health, connect with the Department of Health. If you're doing a project that particularly emphasises the education, have a look on the Department of Education and see if there are any funding streams going. And then there is the British Council for projects abroad. Moving on to the pink box below, we have theatre tax relief. Jackie's already mentioned the financial benefits of theatre tax relief, and you can include the money from your TTR claim as a source of income. What you'll have to be careful with is your timeline, so being mindful about when you'll receive that claim. But we do have ITC organisations that have done this. Right, so that's TTR. The next one, investors, in the orange box. So investors, or high net worth individuals, as they're sometimes referred to. This is really seen as the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in our sector. They're rare, and I've seen a lot of companies use too many resources and too much time trying to attract them. Don't base your business plan around them. But the few successful stories with high net worth individuals that I have seen in our sector have at their core a good long-term relationship with a person. And this person may have come sideways through another area of funding, for example, through corporate sponsorship, which takes me neatly onto the pink box on the other side. So we have in-kind support and sponsorship. It's important to recognize that sponsorship is a business deal. It's not a gift. You're receiving money in exchange for something. And it could be as simple as a commitment to put the company's logo on all your comms, or it could be a bit more complex. In-kind support could also be a contract, business contract, or it could be a gift. I will quickly outline what in-kind support is for those of you who don't know. So if a dance studio gives me a week in one of their studios for free, and it's a rate that would usually cost £600 a week, that's £600 I can put in my funding budget towards match funding. This is really useful for applying for somewhere like the Arts Council, who ideally want you to be sourcing 40 to 50% of your income from other areas. So you could use this in-kind support to make up that 40-50% of match funding. But we can talk about that more. Do put in the comments box if you have further questions on that. Moving to the yellow box at the top, box office deals. These are really tricky. They're always quite intimidating to negotiate. We do actually run a negotiations course, which Charlotte does, that really helps with kind of building confidence in this area. There are different types of box office deals that you can negotiate. There's a guarantee up front, which is incredibly hard to negotiate. That's when you get a little bit of money prior to your production. And then there's a box office split, where you're splitting the profit of tickets. And then there's kind of different combinations all the way in between there. There's a really good website and resource on, well, a resource on the House website, which has a really good breakdown of all the different types of deals that you can ask for, which we'll put in an email to you, or we can put as a link below. Fees from other venues, that's similar to box office, other activities and workshops. It's been really exciting to see how ITC members and the sector as a whole has kind of risen to the challenge with going digital and massively increasing their output with digital workshops. And that is a way to make money. Don't be scared to charge for that. And also it increases your reach, which, going back to that kind of reach versus the amount of money you're asking for, is really useful in that area. And finally, trusts and foundations. So that's the blue box at the bottom. As Jackie mentioned, there are a number of trusts and foundations that will only accept applications from charities. This is not because they don't want to, it's because they can't. With trusts and foundations, a lot of people ask us if there's like a book or a massive resource with all the trusts and foundations listed in it. I personally don't know if there is. Maybe if you know, please do put in the comments box. But my top tip with trusts and foundations, finding the right one for you, is to do some research on other companies that have a similar vibe, a similar output, a similar mission to you, to go to their website, to scroll down to the footer, and to look at the logos of the trusts and foundations that are funding them. And it's likely that those trusts and foundations would also be interested in funding the type of work that you do. So that's just a whistle-stop tour through all the different types of funding sources that you can be drawing from. Can we move to the next slide, please, Zoe? Cheers. Okay, so just a few common mistakes when writing funding applications. This is what we kind of hear back from funders, and this is also from my own experience as well. First of all, not understanding the requirements set out by the funder. Like I mentioned, check if you're eligible to apply to something. Otherwise, you'll just be wasting your time, and time is so precious in our sector. Failure to follow instructions. Like I said, particularly now, funders will be receiving a lot of applications. So something as small as not writing in capitals, if you're meant to write in capitals somewhere, might make a difference, especially if a funder, especially if it's like the 30th application that the funder has looked at that day. So really make sure that you read the instructions. Sending too much irrelevant information. I know, I understand, I've done it as well. I've written kind of my heart and soul onto an application and my life story and all the motivations for why I want to get this work out into the world. And that's wonderful. But again, there's a lot of applications going out at the moment and funders are completely overwhelmed. So keeping it concise absolutely will help your bid. And poor presentation, again, lay it out clearly, lay it out neatly, and it will help your application be read. Finally, fundraising is about building relationships. I think we have a temptation to see the funder as the enemy. It's us versus them. And I'm not convinced this is a helpful way of thinking. It's about finding a funder who wants to change the world in the same way that you do. And here it says, remember to say thank you after they give you money, but I would also say thank you after, even if your bid is rejected, because someone's taken the time to read your application and you never know when your paths may cross in the future. So that's me for funding, and I'm going to hand back to Charlotte now for contracts and negotiations.
Thank you very much, Thea. Yes, contracts. Well, this is obviously a huge area that ITC deals with and can help with on a daily basis. And what you're seeing there is the definition of a contract. Contract is a legally binding business agreement between two or more parties involving some form of exchange. You will notice that it doesn't mention paper. It doesn't mention an object. That's because a contract isn't actually a piece of paper. Verbal contracts can be, and in fact very often are, legally binding. But of course, the problem with a verbal contract is it's impossible to prove that it was made, and it's impossible to prove what its terms were. So I would say, well, one of our absolute golden rules is get it in writing, sign it, date it. If you'd like to turn over the next slide, Zoe, I'll just unpick that definition a little bit. So when does a contract exist? Well, essentially, in order for a contract to exist, there needs to be an offer capable of acceptance. That offer needs to be accepted. There needs to be some form of exchange, which is effectively the kind of detriment to one side and benefit to another. And there needs to be the intention to create legal relations. So you must have actually intended to get into this agreement and make a legally binding contract. All of those things have to be there in order for a contract to exist. And obviously we've only got a few minutes, but I spent a year at law school sort of unpicking all of that. If you'd like to move on to the next slide, Zoe. What should a contract contain? One of the things that I think is really important to establish and hold on to in the whole process of contracting is basically to understand that you can pretty much contract on any basis you like. Although I will talk to you in a minute when we talk about employment about a very important exception to that. But essentially, what should a contract contain? Simple expressions of the deal you have done, basically. But it does need to contain a few very important things that I've detailed here. First of all, you need the parties of the contract to be clearly described. If it's a limited company, make sure you look them up at Companies House, make sure they exist, make sure the name is correct. If it's a person, just check that you're getting the right name or their equity name, or make sure that it's clear. Put down both if you have any sort of doubt. Very importantly, the date of the agreement. Contract is dominated by chronology. The latest contract you make will be the valid one, the active one, even if it's a verbal one. So the date of that agreement is very important. You'll need to express the exchange, what it is, how much, essentially. And then a range of terms and conditions. You will probably all have seen contracts, 70, 80 pages long, full of detail that you don't understand. It can also be very simple, just answering these questions, really, the kind of how, the where, the when, the what else. And then very importantly, you need clauses in there to talk about how you end this contract or how you get out of it. Cancellation clause, what happens if something goes wrong? Obviously, we've done a lot of talking about this in the last few months, looking at the kind of impact of COVID on contractual relationships. Doesn't actually change things very much, but it's a really good idea to build into your contracts that kind of sense of risk assessment and maybe detail exactly what you would do if the pandemic had an impact on what you were going to be doing. Next slide, Zoe, please. So once you've made a contract, it's probably worth thinking about how you get out of it. The simplest and best way, obviously, of ending a contract is to complete it in the terms that you have agreed, to the letter of the agreement. And once it's done, it's finished, it's over. However, sometimes that doesn't work. Obviously, if things go wrong, you may have spent quite a lot of time negotiating your way into a contract. You can, of course, negotiate your way out. Keep talking, nurture the agreement. And if things change and you need to kind of end the contract, then you can obviously discuss it by sort of mutual agreement. If you can't reach an agreement, then you may well be looking at the situation where a contract has been what they call breached. But this is where one party doesn't fulfill their obligations properly or doesn't fulfill them at all. You've then got an injured party and a sort of breaching party. Obviously, if you've got something in your contract, a what-if clause that deals with that, then that's great. That's what they call kind of liquidated damages. You can use the contract to kind of deal with the breach. If that's not possible, sometimes you have to end up having recourse to court action. And there are various remedies available. You will all probably have heard of damages, which put somebody back in the position they would have been in if the contract had been performed. There are also, though, possible court orders that actually take things into the criminal realm, which force people to fulfill their part of a contract, like a specific performance order, or indeed prevent them from continuing the breach, which is particularly common in intellectual property type situations in the arts. So that's called an injunction, and that's a court order that stops you doing something. You will have heard probably quite a lot of talk during the pandemic about the concept of force majeure or frustration of contract. The frustration of contract is where the contract cannot be performed because of a supervening event. And it's a little bit like what happens with frustration of contract. It's a little bit like pass the parcel when the music stops. Essentially, when that supervening event happens, whatever your position is at that moment, it stays that way. So, for example, if you had a fee up front for your performance at a venue, and that venue closed as a result of a power cut or pandemic, then you get to hang on to that fee. You don't have to carry out your performance. Conversely, though, if you hadn't had any of that fee up front, you wouldn't get any of it. So whatever the position is, it stays that way on the frustration of contract. You can build into your contracts clauses that deal with what happens on frustration, and that's called your force majeure. And a lot of people obviously are having to think a lot more about that these days. These clauses were in contracts and probably were ignored, and it was all like, oh yeah, that's the act of God clause. These acts of God happen, don't they? So let's have another slide. Right, employment law. Now this is the exception, if you like, to the rule that I said at the beginning, which was that you can contract on any basis you like. You can, but there are certain types of contract which are very governed by statute, by the law, if you like, the written law. And employment is one such area. So the rule that you can contract on any basis you like is definitely restricted in the employment realm. So, for example, if you were contracting a freelancer, you contract them for the services that they're going to provide, and it's up to them really how long they take over it. So, you know, you only pay someone £100 for a particular project. They take 100 hours to do it. They're working for £1 an hour. But they couldn't claim that they were requiring the national minimum wage, which is what you would have to pay if you were employing them. So minimum wage is covered by statute, working time regulations, which came in through the EU. So there's a limit on the number of hours that you can get someone to work. You have to pay holiday pay. You have to give certain types of breaks and time off. Pensions is now included. So even if you say in your contract of employment that you're not providing a pension, you do still have to do that. Tax, national insurance, data protection, health and safety. Paternity, maternity, parenting leave, these are all things that get included into a contract, even if you're silent on them. So there's a whole raft of employer responsibilities that come in when you're contracting people as an employer. If you'd like to go on to the next slide, I think this might be about, yes, employee or freelancer. So as I said, if you are an employee, you are protected by lots of statutory stuff in terms of your contracts of employment. If you are a freelancer, you are not. Obviously, some people choose to be freelance in this industry. Some people probably are freelance and not wanting that. One of the areas that I think is probably important to kind of touch upon is the particular status of actors. Now, actors look like they're freelancers because they have a special tax status, which came in through a piece of a case law back in the 90s. So they are kind of self-assessed for tax purposes, and they don't pay national insurance, or you don't make national insurance contributions anymore. But they are not freelancers because you are governing their work. There is a master-servant relationship there. You know, as an actor, you can't say I'm working from home. Oh, you know, I'm going to do my work in my own time. Obviously, you have to be there in person to make the performance in the place that is stated by your employment. So actors are actually employees or workers, and therefore are protected by all of the employment legislation. And it's extremely important for you to kind of hold on to this. It's not a choice being a freelancer or an employee. It's governed by what your status is and whether there is that master-servant relationship there. So the contract for services makes you a freelancer, and the contract of service, which is where you are kind of, your work is controlled by the employer, makes you an employee. Obviously, there's lots and lots we could be talking about around that, and I'm sure there are questions on it. And this is something that ITC helps people with on a daily basis with advice. I think that's it on employment. Would you like to just go on to the next slide, Zoe, just in case I've missed something? I have. Recruitment. So I'm not going to talk a lot about recruitment because it's a huge area, and we do run some training on it. But just 3 things I want you to just kind of take away that are important. Equal opportunities and anti-discrimination legislation. There are 9 protected characteristics, which I detailed here, and you need to be particularly careful in recruitment around avoiding discrimination on that basis. If you're recruiting somebody that you want to have working with young people or vulnerable adults, then you will need to get police checks, DBS checks. So this is something that ITC can help with. It is also worth noting that you will have to start the process of recruitment and quite early on because police checks take quite a lot of time. You can't do DBS checks unless you absolutely need them. It's not something you can kind of decide that you're going to do with all your employees. There has to be the requirement based on who they're working with, children or vulnerable adults. And finally, this is going to be extremely important in the months coming because you need to check that they have permission to work in the UK. It's a criminal offence to engage someone who doesn't have the right to work in the UK. And obviously it's potentially possible that this is going to be happening to all of our colleagues across the EU over the next few months. So again, we are keeping an eye on this, and we'll be helping and advising people how to navigate it. But it's something you as an employer need to be aware of at this stage in the process, that you may well need to consider with everyone you employ whether they have the right to work. Right, That is a complete rush through employment. Obviously, it could take hours, and we have lots of courses that we do with copyright. I think, Jackie, you were going to say a couple of words, weren't you? On is Jackie there? Maybe she's not. So
sorry, I was looking at the question about the tax case, which is McCowan and West in the mid-90s.
That's right, it is.
It's just actually been reiterated and re-emphasised by new guidance on employers and tax that came out from HMRC the other day, that all the management bodies and equity were very involved with. So there is brand new guidance out that really says the same old, same old. As far as intellectual property law is concerned, it's another one we could talk about for many days, but time is against us. So a few really key points I always want people to take away. The first is that intellectual property law, as it says there, actually turns things that are intellectual into something that can be traded, bought, sold, leased and licensed like real property. But despite this, my first key point is to remember that intellectual property law doesn't protect ideas. Copyright comes into play when a work is fixed, when it's something that can be copied. And this is incredibly important in a sector where there's very often an originating creative idea. There are ideas being fed into the rehearsal and devising room. These are very rarely actually protected by IP. They're anybody's. So be careful how you share your ideas. Another key point is that there are lots of different types of IP rights, and there may be, for instance, copyright in different elements of a production, such as a script, a score, the choreography. These are all separate rights initially in the main, so there is very rarely just one overarching copyright in a production. People very often have the idea that they own a production, and it's possible they do, but it's quite likely they don't. Because what can be done, it's my third point, is that contracts can allocate and reallocate ownership of copyright. So you've got a production, if you've got a freelance, if someone creates something that's copyrighted, it arises automatically, and if they're a freelance, they own it. If they are an employee, the employer owns it. So if you have several different freelance contributors, you can have a contract that says you own their work. And if you've got that contract with all your freelancers and some of your creatives are employees, you will own everything. But if you've only got a short-term right to use that creative work, then you don't own the whole production. People can actually go off and sell off some of the elements of it separately. So those are my three things to remember. No protection of ideas, rarely an overarching right. Make sure that your contracts enable you to control copyright and other IP rights to ensure that you can use them as you want to.
Superb, thank you.